Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. Today we're going to be reviewing A Better Land by Brian Auger's Oblivion Express.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
But before we even get into this video, you all are probably asking yourselves, what is this here behind me? So I'll show you all this right now. So this has been something very special. I love how the lighting just doesn't know what to do with me. But this thing, well, it's a souvenir of sorts, let's say. As you can see, despite it being flipped around, you can definitely tell that this is the 365 Days of Prog logo. And then of course we have all of these signatures on here, which are actually signatures from all the participating artists in the Night of the Prog Festival, which I attended about 2 months ago. So it would be hard for me to try and tell you all which autographs exist on here, but I kind of remember loosely this one and this one belonging to PFM, and I know that the ones in colors on here on the sides are like my blank manuscript, and there's also some really nice stuff written to me on here, and some of them even saw my video, so they're like, oh yeah, of course we'll sign it up. And that's how I got this. Now this is actually a shirt which I cut out and I pasted to this canvas, but I think that it looks amazing, and it looks amazing on the wall, and it will be our souvenir for the remainder of this series. But yeah, with that gotten out of the way, we can start with this video, and of course with some of my favorite bits from this album. So you know, the world isn't a beautiful place like many people try and describe it as, and if you look around every single corner you might be able to find a very nasty person, only if you go looking for them, unless they find you first. There are a lot of depraved minds in this world, and honestly, while I try to step away and not get close to them, I sometimes make some slip-ups, and it seems like today I've made a big slip-up, because the person who recommended this album to me seems to have a very twisted mind. This person, if you can even call them a human being, has decided to recommend this album today to me in the purpose of abolishing 365 Days of Prog, recommending an album that is so out of the norm, so non-progressive, and so widely regarded as being a bad album that they truly just wanted to cause harm. And this album is of course no other than Brian Auger's Oblivion Express's A Better Land. Now firstly, of course, I'm sorry, this is just a joke. Whoever recommended this to me, it's fine. If you like this album, that's good, but honestly, I don't really know what it's doing on here, because out of the extensive discography that is held to the name of Brian Auger, this would be one of the worst picks to choose, and that's not just me saying, this is the wide opinion of many people looking at this one as some sort of an anomaly. Out of a great discography, this one just doesn't stand up to the level at all. So to whoever chose to recommend this album to me today, you probably didn't want me to stick around and listen to the rest of Brian Auger's discography, because this is one of the worst entry points one can possibly get. But before we open this Pandora's box of opinions, firstly let's get right into talking about the person and subsequently the group that made this album, known as Brian Auger, or as a whole as Brian Auger's Oblivion Express. So Auger was born in 1939, in a year in which England has just joined World War II. And amidst the war going going on, a 3-year-old Brian Auger has just discovered his newfound love for the instrument known as a piano, and specifically he would listen to others play the piano and he would notice that he could recognize patterns in the way that they would play their notes, and thus chaining them in his mind he would be able to reconstruct entire melodies off of memory and hearing alone. So naturally, at a young age, Brian Auger had started to play the piano, and unfortunately quite suddenly in 1944, amidst a German blitzkrieg, the house of the Auger family was destroyed and thus with it also their piano. But of course persistence was the keyword here, and the family acquired a new piano on which Brian would go on to play for the years to come. And as the year progressed, the war would have come to pass, but what didn't pass was Auger's love of the keys, and instead he would go on to perfect his skills on the instrument. And at the same time, Auger would start exposing himself to different types of genres of music outside of classical music, such as jazz, and especially artists like Count Basie and Duke Ellington, as well as exposing himself to the much more conventional genre of music known as pop, and specifically American and English pop, when specifically he would even later on refer to the Beatles as being one of his biggest inspirations in music. And at the age of 22, Auger would finally assemble his first band and show his skills as a band leader, and this band comprised of a trio would be called Trinity. Now I will admit that searching up information online has left me kind of baffled on the undoings of this band, but what I do know that the band has experienced some sort of a rebirth in 1966, and they had a pretty successful run until finally disbanding in 1970. But amidst their runtime, Trinity would open for a few major acts such as Led Zeppelin. Now considering the fact that Brian Auger actually played with the Yardbirds on the 1965 single For Your Love, especially he played the harpsichord on there, it is easy to understand how he later found himself acquainted with Led Zeppelin. And also during his time with Trinity, another major event would happen. Auger would acquaint himself with a new type of keyboard with a very unique sound that he'd never heard before, and specifically would hear it firstly in Jimmy Smith's music. And if you haven't heard Midnight Special, you should probably go ahead and check it out. And of course the instrument I'm talking about is no other than the infamous Hammond organ. And being stoked about the unique sound and the possibilities with an instrument such as that, Brian Auger would quickly acquire a piece of his own and perfect his skills on it, being considered in later days to be one of the masters of the instrument of all times. And for the last stop of the historical overview for this video, after breaking up in 1970, Brian would go on quickly to form yet another band, this time more self-centered, and this one would be called Brian Auger's Oblivion Express. Now when looking on the Prog archives online on the discography of the Brian Auger Oblivion Express band, we can safely say that there is some sort of a consistency with the ratings of their album, with the debut self-titled one receiving a rating of 3.77. Second Wind gets a rating of 3.50, and Closer to It gets a whopping rating of 3.76. And later on we also have an album like Straight Ahead with a rating of 3.33. But you might have noticed from the screen right now that I've neglected to mention one album, and it's their sophomore album, which also happens to be the one we're reviewing today, called A Better Land. Now this one, what rating do you think that this one gets? Might it be a 3.7? Might it be a 3.6? Maybe just a 3.5? Or maybe even a 3.33 like one of its counterparts? Well, no, this one today gets a rating, an abysmal rating of 2.55, and if you ask me, it's a pretty laughable rating. And usually I don't let such ratings take a toll on the way that I look at certain albums, and I especially didn't do it with this one, knowing that a lot of people might have thought this one to be abysmal, but who knows, maybe this one was actually not that bad. I've had it in the past with an album like Love Beach by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and I don't regret the rating I've given to it then, despite it being pretty much a counterpoint to the entire community of prog. And in a very true Naomi fashion today, I gave this album an objective listen, and while I can say that I kinda didn't really like this one that much, it also wasn't as bad as a lot of people made it out to be. But why? Why is this one considered to be such a letdown for Brian Auger fans and fans of jazz fusion as a whole? Well, I think that the simple answer to this would be, this really isn't jazz, this isn't fusion, this isn't nothing of that. The best description I could give to an album like this I've seen online, and it reads, a pretty much basic South Californian soft rock band. This album unfortunately is as bland and unoriginal as one can get, honestly. It really doesn't feature anything new, the songs are indistinguishable from one another, they're really just not that ideal for listening as a whole, and it's honestly a very big letdown for me. And if this is the only thing that I knew of Brian Auger's discography as I know right now, I probably wouldn't want to come back to it, but of course I know that this is just a tiny sample and there's probably a lot more good to find out about. I know that avid viewers of this series are going to give this one a listen or maybe already know it, and honestly I'm very sorry, and if you don't want to listen to this one, just don't. It's really not a miss for anything. It's not like my personal opinion of it that it's not progressive is something that might change from one another. I think that this one is pretty much objectively not prog, and thus it's just wasting my time on my precious prog series. I think that the only track on here that kind of gives us a sliver of hope to what this band might be capable of is the track All the Time There Is. This one at least has some jazzy influences in it, and despite not being good like the rest of the songs on here, at least I can see something that really connects this one to the origins of this artist in particular. Now, looking up online, I tried to find a reason why this one was such an anomaly. Why was this one so badly received, and why was in its essence this one not a jazz fusion album and such a more accessible album that honestly doesn't really appeal to anyone that's looking for really good music? And well, while I couldn't find a definitive answer, I would state the following hypothesis. I think that Brian Auger's music by this point was probably not as successful as the record company wanted it to be, so they simply demanded him making a better, more accessible album for the masses, and that's exactly what he produced on here, an album which is overall fine for like radio purposes, but honestly not that memorable, especially not in the long run. And this is also why it's very interesting that someone actually recommended this one to me, because it states that actually there is someone, and there's probably more people in the world that have heard this one at some point and thought that it was good enough to remember, and alas recommended it to me later on. But as I said, this is not particularly such a bad album. I didn't find myself suffering through this one, I just found it to be very much wasting my time, but the music on here was fine. And when judged not in the prospect of prog, I do think that this album is pretty fine for what it is, but to my purposes, really a needless album to say the least. So if any of you know Brian Auger's discography, which is a lengthy one, and want to recommend a better album in your opinion that fits more with the progressive genre, I'd love to know what you have to say about it down in the comments. Overcrowded would probably be an understatement for this one. There's a lot going on in this cover, and while I do believe that there's some sort of a unique beauty in the way that this one is drawn, it is just so overcrowded, and there's no one focal point that you can point into and look at and experience the entire thing. And of course, when being looked at from afar, this cover is so non-discernible, which is honestly quite painful. Nevertheless, this album cover does feature some very interesting styles of art, and of course some very interesting landscapes as well. I like the drawing on it. I just think that the execution and the way that it's all composed on here is not that good, and if they spaced things out and made this one into more of a landscape drawing that has a lot of space within subjects in it, I think that it would have been a whole lot better. So yeah, this one gets a rating of 5 out of 10, and honestly it's a blessing that I don't know any of the other works by Brian Auger or Brian Auger's Oblivion Express, because if I do, this one would have probably been rated a whole lot lower. But that's about it, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to At the Sound of a Bell by Pavlov's Dog. I of course want to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Warren, Rest of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it, guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye, guys.